asking, I answer, I cannot answer, you must find out for yourself, right? And menaced in this uncertain place by monsters, fancy lights, risking enchantment. And then he says it finally, do not let me hear of the wisdom of old men, but rather of their folly. I'm not interested in you holding up the great poets and telling me they had it all figured out. Now there's a lot of irony because of course T.S. Eliot becomes one of these important giants, right? I mean, hello, we're studying his poem. And yet he says, I'm not altogether sure, it sounds kind of Promethean, I don't want to hear about the wisdom of old men. Why? Well, their fear. Their fear of fear. Their fear of frenzy. Their fear of possession, of belonging to another, the inability to connect, as we saw in the dance in part 1, or to others, or to God. In other words, it seems that skeptics often make great artists, but he says, I'm not altogether sure that they help us very much because we're at the edge of a grimpen, a bog, and we're ready to slip and fall in. Who's going to help us to find our way? What is the wisdom that we're looking for? Well, here we are at line 98, and it's taken us a while to get here, okay? The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is in this. Humility, in other words, is the key. Okay? Here we think of the idea of patience again. Be still, we're going to hear later, right? Humility is the key. In terms of trying to get through this experience and not believing that I am too full of myself and my knowledge, right? Okay. And then the poem, the section 2 finishes with, the houses, we're back to line 2 of the opening of East Coker, are all gone under the sea. The dancers are all gone under the hill, and dancers, of course, from line 28. Notice we're returning back to stanza number 1. Again, notice that under the sea, under the hill, these prepositions are so important in our study. Now, when I read this under the sea, I can't help but be reminded of what for some of you, you told me, was your favorite part of The Wasteland. Part number 4, Death by Water. Do you remember these lines? Let's just enjoy them because they're so beautiful. Phoebus, the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell and the profit and loss. A current undersea picked his bones and whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phoebus, who was once handsome and tall as you. Of course, you can go back to my lectures on Wasteland to hear me explicate these lines. I just want to point out that the houses are all gone under the sea reminds me of Phoebus, the Phoenician, the sailor, who also went under the sea. In other words, everything seems to be kind of cyclical here, right? The idea then is wisdom is something beyond knowledge, right? It is humility. It is surrender. We're going to learn more about this in part 3 here in a second. Endless humility. This notion of wisdom takes us back to Whitman's Song of the Open Road. Remember what he said? Wisdom is not finally tested in schools, can't be passed from one having it to another not having it. Wisdom is of the soul, is not susceptible of proof, is its own proof. End quote. Of course, here, notice, T.S. Eliot is going to, as poet, resurrect the question, how much can we trust these poets? Right? And, of course, the postmodern critique will in fact continue to ask this question about the whole notion of the canon. I have colleagues who will say, I don't even know why you teach writers like T.S. Eliot. They've come and gone, and there's no point in studying them anymore. I'm not thoroughly convinced of that. But then this speaker poet will say, these old men, I don't know. We got to think a little bit about what these old men had to say, because it seems like a lot of what they wrote out of was fear, and fear of any number of things, even fear of connecting or belonging to another. Well, let's finish at 2a. Our fear leads to a need for belonging, which leads to the need for surrender, and then ultimately sacrifice. We're going to hear more about that one in a bit. At 2b, the symbols. I like the symbol of the old men, right? Who are going to be the ones who leave us these receipts for deceit and all of that, right? One of my students once said, receipt for deceit, that's called a high school or a college diploma. When I'm holding that diploma, that is my receipt for deceit? I would argue that it is only if one has spent one's high school and college years not thinking about these kinds of questions, right? At 3a, of course, here we've already read, from Wasteland Part 4. I love that, Phlebas the physician, that Phoenician, that works very well here for us. At 3b, this is an interesting question at 3b. Maybe you can apply it. Do you think the past and respecting the past is really that important? We do a lot of it in school, don't we, right? I mean, when you are studying Pythagoras' theorem, you're studying actually about the life of Pythagoras, that great math mind. But what's the point? I mean, is there any value in it? Well, let's turn now to part 3. This one we could simply write as a heading as "Be Still." This is the centering movement, just like we saw in Burnt Norton. It's the middle part of the poem, right? And we're working now with lines 102 to lines 148. Now we'll go ahead and we'll listen to this one. Oh, dark, 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 right? Thinking back to Burnt Norton and the opening lines of Burnt Norton 3. Look at this one at Burnt Norton 3 really quickly, just to get a sense of it again. Here is a place, he says, of disaffection, time before and time after in a dim light, neither daylight investing form with lucid stillness, turning shadow into transient beauty, with slow rotation suggesting permanence, nor darkness to purify the soul, emptying the sensual with deprivation, cleansing affection from the temporal. We're back to this darkness again. So put it in your notes. We're going to see darkness now and the role of darkness. And one more time we're going to hear about the foolishness of thinking somehow that you're important enough to be remembered. We'll play that game. Follow along. Here we go. Part 3 of East Coker.
Oh, dark, 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 they all go into the dark. The vacant interstellar spaces, the vacant into the vacant. The captains, merchant bankers, eminent men of letters, the generous patrons of art, the statesmen and the rulers, distinguished civil servants, chairmen of many committees, industrial lords and petty contractors all go into the dark. And dark the sun and moon, and the Almanac de Gotha, and the Stock Exchange Gazette, the Directory of Directors, and cold the sense and lost the motive of action. And we all go with them into the silent funeral, nobody's funeral, for there is no one to bury. I said to my soul, be still, and let the dark come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God. As in a theatre, the lights are extinguished for the scene to be changed, with a hollow rumble of wings, with a movement of darkness on darkness, and we know that the hills and the trees, the distant panorama, and the bold, imposing facade are all being rolled away, or as when an underground train in the tube stops too long between stations, and the conversation rises and slowly fades into silence, and you see behind every face the mental emptiness deepen, leaving only the growing terror of nothing to think about, or when under ether the mind is conscious, but conscious of nothing. I said to my soul, be still, and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness the dancing. Whisper of running streams and winter lightning, the wild thyme unseen and the wild strawberry, the laughter in the garden, echoed ecstasy not lost but requiring, pointing to the agony of death and birth. You say I am repeating something I have said before. I shall say it again. Shall I say it again? In order to arrive there, to arrive where you are, to get from where you are not, you must go by a way wherein there is no ecstasy. In order to arrive at what you do not know, You must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. In order to arrive at what you are not, you must go through the way in which you are not. And what you do not know is the only thing you know. And what you own is what you do not own. And where you are is where you are not.
All right, let's turn now to part 3. Be still. I think you can understand right away why this one is significant. And notice right away we begin with the repetition of the word dark. Dark, dark, dark. They all go into the dark. Now who the they is, again, we have to figure out. The vacant interstellar spaces, the vacant into the vacant. And then he starts to list who they all are. Captains, merchant bankers, eminent men of letters. Note the irony that T.S. Eliot will be included in that list of great men of letters, right? Poets and writers and whatever. The generous patrons of the art, the statesmen, the rulers, distinguished civil servants, chairmen of many committees, industrial lords, petty contractors, all go into the dark. And dark, the sun and moon. In other words, in the same way that everybody who's lived on this planet ends up dying, ultimately the sun and the moon also go dark. They also go away. He quotes here the Almanac de Gotha, which was the directory of the most important, influential royalty in all of Europe. The Stock Exchange Gazette, it has been pointed out that he says that the loss of the Stock Exchange newspaper, the Wall Street Journal being referenced in some ways here, right, becomes even greater as a loss than even the sun and the moon. The directory of directors, and cold the sense. We think of the word chill from earlier in Bert Norton. And lost the motive of action. And we all go with them into the silent funeral. Now this lost the motive of action. I mean, we have to think about our Hamlet, don't we? The to be or not to be speech. Remember at the very end of that one, thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action, from Hamlet 3:1, lines 83 to 88. So here we are. Notice T.S. Eliot borrowing and alluding in so many ways to different texts that are important, right? He says, nobody's funeral, for there is no one to bury. Now, the way he says this, let the dead bury the dead, of course, Christ will have said in the Gospels. And the idea seems to be here that in the end, it's kind of silly because we're all ultimate. I mean, you can't think of yourself as too important. Go back to Hamlet Act 5. I think Hamlet is a very influential part of East Coker in the back of the mind of T.S. Eliot. Go back to Hamlet Act 5. Remember how that scene opens? We lecture on this one in our senior A folder. Go back to those lines. Remember how we've got grave diggers who are making fun of the dead. The grave diggers, the lowliest, and they're knocking around the shovel with the shovel. They're knocking around the head of some really high-powered lawyer or something like that. In other words, what's the point being made here? In the end, we all go into the dark. But now the question is it good or bad, this darkness? I said to my soul. We're going to hear this not only at line 113, we're going to see it again over at line 124. And it reminds us of a line or two from the idea of Whitman in Song of Myself, where he talks to his soul. Okay, and here, notice what it is that he says to his soul. Be still. Reminds us of that Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and let the dark come upon you, which shall be the darkness of God. Now we're two Christian mystics. St. John of the Cross is dark night of the soul. And then we're going to get 3 similes to try to explain the use of darkness. The first is the theater, which is significant because, of course, Shakespeare reminds us how important the theater is as representative, as Aristotle taught him, as representative of human existence. As he says in a theater, the lights are extinguished. The lights go out in between scenes for the scene to be changed with a hollow rumble of wings out in the wings of the theater, right? With a movement of darkness on darkness. And we know that the hills and the trees, the distant panorama of the scene, right? And the bold, imposing facade are all being rolled away. that term rolled away, of course, in Christian symbolism on Easter Sunday when, of course, the resurrection of Christ occurs. But the first simile that he uses to try to describe what it's like, this darkness, is when you're sitting in a theater watching the play, and all of a sudden the lights go out for a second, it's totally dark, and you can hear and you know that something's happening. The second simile, starting at line 119, or as when an underground train, the subway, this won't shock us, T.S. Eliot loves his train references in the tube, stops too long between stations, and the conversation rises and slowly fades into silence. Again, we're back to the word silence. And you see behind every face the mental emptiness deepen, leaving only the growing terror of nothing to think about. You're sitting on the train, all of a sudden it pauses, everything is kind of, quiet, and then there's a terror because you don't know what to think about. We go back to the Scrooge story. Remember, it's significant that that third ghost doesn't talk. Dressed all in black, points simply at a tombstone. And the terror or the horror that Scrooge then feels, to go to the moment of one's death and to actually recognize there will be a moment when your pulse no longer is yours. What will that be like? We have these weird moments of insight. This poem helps us get there, right? That'll be a strange darkness. We think, of course, about that whole scene from Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Tom Stoppard's great play, where I wonder what it's like to be buried in a box. I'd rather be alive in a box than dead in a box, and all of that, right? The third one, the third simile. If the first simile is the theater, and the second simile is the train or the subway. The third one is when under ether, line 123, we think of the opening lines of Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is set out against the sky like a patient etherized upon our table. This notion of being etherized, we're going to come in part 4 here in a second to this notion of the surgeon, the wounded surgeon who is working on the patient, maybe etherized, right? When under ether, the mind is conscious, but conscious of nothing. And then he says it again at line 124. I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope. Patience, in other words, is all about humility. We're going to get to this humility thing again as we go into this, right? He just called it that the importance of humility. For hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love. In a minute, and immediately when we use both hope and love, we recognize that we're in 1 Corinthians 13, the Pauline chapter of love. Remember, the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love, right? Love, he said, would be love of the wrong thing. He says there is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. In other words, patience. Wait without thought, he says, for you're not ready for thought. Humankind cannot bear very much reality, to go back to Bert Norton. So the darkness shall be the light. Notice here, again, we're back to St. John, the Christian mystics. The darkness shall be the light, and the stillness, the dancing. We're back to dancing again, right, earlier in East Coker. And then at line 130 to 134, then we get an interesting little poem within the poem about nature. Whisper of running streams and winter lightning. The wild thyme unseen and wild strawberry, back to more plants and vegetation. The laughter in the garden from Bert Norton, 175, line 174, 75. Echo to ecstasy, the epiphany that we've been talking about and the search for the epiphany. Not lost, but requiring, pointing to the agony of death and birth. Think about that. Michelangelo, great story about Michelangelo, the agony and the ecstasy, somehow containing both, right? Well, here obviously in lines 102 to 134, we're talking about the value of darkness, right? We're being reminded that no matter how great you are, everyone ends up going down, right? This notion of being still and knowing that I am God from Psalm 46:10 has to be in the back of the mind, as well as Yeats's poem, Dialogue of Self and Soul, that exchange back and forth. The darkness of God reminds us of Wallace Stevens, The Snowman. Remember those lines? The nothing that is there and the nothing that is not. Okay? And then the three similes, again, will take us to help us. Think about faith, hope, and love. If faith is backwards looking and hope is forwards looking, then love is about the present, the waiting, the humility, the surrender. And now, of course, paradoxically, darkness becomes light, right? We continue now at lines 135 to the end. He says, you say I am repeating myself. Now from lines 135 to 148, the word you is repeated 17 times. You can count it for yourself. Note the irony. You say I'm repeating myself. You say I'm repeating something I have said before. I shall say it again. Shall I say it again? Let's pause for a moment and just point out that although this is hard work for us, let's say it out loud, this is hard work for us. You have to go through the art of repetition to be able to actually get it. Most of us don't learn important stuff with one telling. We have to go through it. Ball players know this. Musicians know this. Go through it again and again and again. No question, Eliot has been saying, repeating, echoing, is our term from Bert Norton, again and again and again, right? Well, he says, I'm going to say it one more time. What it is he's going to give to us now is a really interesting way of thinking about this spiritual journey. Exploration is the way he's going to talk about the journey from St. John of the Cross, the ascent of Mount Carmel, the via negativa, the dark night of the soul, the negative way. Or in the Buddhist tradition, it's Nagarjuna's ideas of the way of negation, right? In order to arrive there, as opposed to here, right? To arrive where you are, to get from where you are not, you must go by the way wherein there is no ecstasy. The Zen koan after the ecstasy, the laundry. Jack Kornfield writes a really important contemplative book of using that title, that idea. In order, notice the repetition of the words in order now coming at line 140, 142. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way